Now we're ready. Good morning, I'm Steve Grundman. I'm the director of the Emerging Defense Challenges Initiative here at the Atlanta Council. It's part of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. I'm really pleased and proud to make some welcoming remarks here at the beginning of this event and to introduce our featured speaker. The purpose, what is the purpose? The purpose of the event is to tackle science fiction, Marines, and the future of conflict, which I think is as sexy a title as you're going to hear at a think tank, at least this week. And I think it's at least part of the reason that we have such a great turnout here. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, those of you who are watching on the live stream we have running there. Those of you who are doing neither could watch a replay of the live stream, which we'll have on our website for eternity, as far as I'm aware. I was telling General Alford that I am particularly proud of the part, and it's only a part, that the Atlanta Council's project on the Art of the Future played in this event. This event which culminated in this, right? We are here today. I should elaborate on that title a little bit, right? We are here to celebrate and talk about Science Fiction Futures, a collection of short fiction by Marines about the Marine Corps future warfighting concept, and a series of stories that animate the Marine Corps security environment over the period between 2030 and 2045. It is a complement, I think would be correct to say, although the General will tell us more. It is a complement to the Marine Corps future warfighting concept. The instigation for it was a workshop that the Atlanta Council facilitated, and we have a couple of the panelists here. Two of the panelists were among those facilitators. The project director, August Cole, who is somewhere here and will mount the stage a little while to moderate the discussion, and Chuck Gannon, the author of Rumors of War and Infernal Machines. The other facilitator at the event was a non-resident senior fellow of the council, Max Brooks, maybe better known to many of you as the author of World War Z, and a terrific guy. Other panelists who will mount the stage with August and two other panelists with Chuck and August after General Alford's remarks are Aaron Simpson, the former CEO of KRIS Associates. Thank you, Aaron. And Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Kirschner from the Warfighting Lab. Setting this into the context of the Art of the Future, if I may, just for a second. What is the Art of the Future? The Art of the Future is our precocious child here in the Scowcroft Center, whose aim is to engage creativity and the arts to improve or at least mess around with our thinking about the future, particularly the future of warfare, but also the scope is as broad as, let's say, the future of international security. We've been doing this for a little over a couple of years. Like any innovation, it started with a prototype. I conspired with August Cole to do a panel discussion at the tail end of a long day of a strategy conference a couple years ago. Other panelists there included Dave Anthony, the auteur of the Call of Duty war game, video game series. And it was a hit, and it worked. And we've done a number of things since then. The primary channel of The Art of the Future is our website, theartofthefuture.org, where August does a great job of curating original works of art, mostly fiction, but also some graphic art, some video, and other things, as well as commentary. We have a lot of commentary, it seems, from the last couple weeks about movies, right? There have been a lot of movies about the future of war and social conflict, and The Art of the Future is a place where you can go and read some incisive commentary that brings those sort of popular artistic renderings into the frame of relevance for us who day to day are keeping track of and in some cases prosecuting the aims of national security. So the Art of the Future is the initiative under which we have done this. And I wanted to make sure nobody left the room without realizing this is not a one-off event. That is to say, there are a whole series of initiatives and many of them crowd-sourced artistic challenges that flow from this project. But having said that, today's event culminates, again, a particularly proud achievement for the project. I was telling General Alford before the event that a couple of years ago, when we got this thing started, the leadership of the Atlanta Council said to me, "Yeah, but you know, are you making any impact? Are you getting any traction?" My formulation of that question is always, how is this going to change the world? And if 2 years ago I'd answered that question, if I'd had the nerve to answer that question by saying, "Here's how this is going to change the world," a year from now we're going to have a day-long workshop with Marines down at Quantico, helping them construct and write stories that will animate and articulate and make more powerful and meaningful to the Corps the future warfighting concept of the Marines. I'd say that's how we're going to change the world, or at least that's how we're going to start. And lo and behold, that's what we've done. We'd like to do it in lots of other places as well. So those of you who find what we've done here interesting or inspiring and have some applications for this tool, this technology that we've developed of your own, or want to refer to us, I or the project director, August Cole, would welcome that. Thank you. Okay. What we're going to do is General Alford is going to make some remarks, following which I've said so. August is going to moderate a panel discussion. There certainly will be room for questions from the audience. Conceivably, we could even take questions from those of you who are online, because we are live tweeting the event at AC Scowcroft, and we could receive questions or other commentary, I suppose, at the hashtag ACFuture. Again, even those of you in the room, I suppose, could make use of AC Future, but at least those of you on the live stream, we would welcome you doing that. I think I have nearly thanked everybody who had a hand in this but one, and that is the Atlanta Council, like many of the think tanks in town, host military fellows. In our case, each of the 4 military services does us the privilege of giving us the time and attention. Several of them, both present and past, are here in the audience today. Last year's Marine Corps fellow was a terrific guy, Colonel John Dunn, and he was really, must be said, instrumental to making this happen, to making the connection of us to General Alford and the need that they had down there at Quantico. So I think John is out in the Middle Eastern region somewhere these days. But if you're watching, John, hooah. Okay, let me introduce General Alford. All of the bios of those who will appear on the stage here today were available to you in the confirmation message that you got from our staff yesterday. But to bring him up to the stage, let me just say a couple things, even though you might have had the opportunity to read it, about General Alford. He is the commanding general of the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab and the director of the Futures Directorate. Work that he has been doing, assignments he's had since the middle of 2015. As a general officer, he also served as the assistant division commander of the 2nd Marine Division at Camp Lejeune. There's an entire paragraph here of assignments the general has had as a field grade officer, and I dare say they include every operation that I am familiar with, dating all the way back to Operation Just Cause. For those of you who aren't old enough to remember Just Cause, I think it happened in 1983? 89. Okay. We welcome him here. He's going to get this kicked off by putting into a sensible frame of reference and a compelling frame of reference why we're here, why the Marines did this, and the ambitions they have for it going forward. Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Steve. Also, thanks to the Atlanta Council for hosting this for a second year. It's I think just like you, we didn't think it would to grow to what it has. So this is great. August, you were instrumental along with Chuck and Max to putting this together last year and back again. I'd also like to recognize my mean little sister, Erin Simpson. Me and Erin served together back at Marine Corps Command Staff College. So I was a lieutenant colonel instructor, and she was the professor there, and we were on the team together. So yeah, we had a great year together. I see General Gregson is here as well, sir. It's good to see you. Great, sir. You know, as said, we've brought Marines in from all over the globe to do this. There was a fairly large group that applied, and our Futures Assessment Division, one of 7 divisions we have in the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, Futures Director, the first division of the 7, the lead division that starts off everything that we do, scrubbed through the list and came up, I think, what we got, 18 this year. They're coming in, and literally from all over the globe, we got Marines coming in to participate in this workshop, this writing workshop. The same as last year, you know, and we produced this book, and I'll just talk a little bit about the stories in there. Like you, Steve, when we first did this, I'm like, what are we going to do with this? Why are we doing this? And as it's moved along in the past year, I go back all the way to our doctrinal publications, Marine Corps DC MCDPs, that were the rewrites of Marine Corps warfighting, our FMFM warfighting, our philosophy on how we fight. In the there's 7 books, and we consider it our Bible in the Marine Corps. But the 6th one is Command and Control. And in the beginning of that book, it was written in the late 90s, there's a short story, Operation Verbal Image. And it's a short story about the future. And I always loved that story, right? One, the 3-star general's yelling at a squad leader, right? Because which is making a point that we should use mission tactics and commander's intent. But I always loved that story because it set the stage for what you're about to read. And we don't do enough of that. So one of the things that we've talked about is each one of our concepts that we write, that it should start with some type of futuristic short story. It's the hook, I believe. You know, it's just like any great leader usually is a good storyteller. And that's what this is. These are stories that we think are about the future. It causes us to think and to ponder and to maybe not get the future too wrong. And if we're thinking about the future and if we're writing about the future, we're more likely to get it close anyway. So that's what we're doing here. That's what's important about this. We just produced the Marine Corps Operating Concept. It's our capstone concept signed by our Commandant, General Neller. And in the beginning of the first pages, after General Neller's opening, there's a short story about the future. So, and it started with this project, is why we put it in there. So, Jim Trahan, our director of our FAD, future, thanks for what you're doing with this. This is awesome. You know, when I guess the last thing I'd like to close up with is I think about what we're doing. We've always, in the Marine Corps, valued studying our history. Our Commandant has a reading list. As Marine officers and NCOs, we talk a lot about what you've read lately. That's a common question Marines ask each other. But I think a well-rounded Marine also is reading about the future. And the best way to do that is through science fiction, I believe. And there's no better example than Ghost Fleet that August wrote with Peter Singer. So we need more of that, right? And we need to encourage more of that, and this is a step towards that. We're also, the last thing is in our Marine Corps Gazette, we're producing a short story in every monthly issue of the future. So this is starting to catch fire and catch on because of what you've done here, I think, and what the Atlantic Council has helped us with is the reason this is happening. So I'd like to say thank you, and I look forward to the panel and maybe even engaging in the panel with like I said, my mean little sister. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. That was great.
Not going to be mean to me,
Well, thank you all for coming to the event. As Steve said, this is a proud moment for our project and also for the council, which believes in trying to find new ways to engage not only the policy community but a much larger audience. That's an especially, I think, powerful imperative these days as well. And as we've seen in other sectors like technology, the monopoly on good ideas is not constrained or contained rather in any one group. What we did with this project, and we'll talk a bit about this in two different ways today. We're going to talk about the actual sort of process and how this came together and the work that we did, but also the visions of the future that are contained within the document. I think it's also important to say you're going to want to read the short stories, and you can find them at artoffuturewarfare.org. There's a link to it at the top, and you'll find the 3 stories within there: Double 10 Day, Montgomery Crisis, and Water is a Fighting Word. For those of you in the room, you can look around and see the posters that are up on the easels, and we have some also in the hallway. It's a really important visual reminder, I think, too, that when we tell stories, we think visually, and each of these also has that rich tapestry within it that was put together by the writers. John Dunn, the former Marine fellow here, has been thanked, but I think that can't be.
Was John Dunn gave me a call one day last year and said, we're working on this Art of Future Warfare project with August, and we think there's a role for science fiction with the McSef product that you've put out. So we set up a meeting. We sat and talked for a couple hours last December and came up with the idea that if we held a workshop and we got some professional science fiction authors to come and got Marines and other service members to submit a writing sample, we could actually bring them in, coach them, and come up with stories. So we sent out a MAR admin, which is a Marine admin message, goes around the world to all Marines, and it was a call for authors. I got 74 submissions looking for a science fiction futures project, and once we called out the People's Master's Thesis on 16th century Russian economics, things like that, we got down to 24. And then Mr. Trahan, my boss, mentioned that there's this whole realm of writing that's distinct from science fiction, and that's science fantasy, and the light bulb went on, and I said, oh, I can take these 6 Game of Thrones stories that are in here and kind of with the Knights and Dragons and kind of cut those out. And we ended up with 18, I thought, really good short stories. So 10 of the writers are local. We pulled another 8 in from around the world, as General Alford said. The farthest traveled was a Corporal Hawkins, who was on embassy duty in Nicosia. And he flew in and landed on Tuesday. The workshop was on Wednesday, and we sent him back on Thursday for 2 reasons. 1, he had duty that weekend, and 2, we wanted to give him a story to tell his grandchildren about. He was such a good writer that the Marine Corps flew him halfway around the world for a 1-day workshop with Max Brooks.
It's like a Webb Griffin novel.
Yeah. We should write a short story just about that and include it in the next one. So we did the workshop. We spent the first half of the day discussing futuring and science fiction, and then the second half of the day actually working on the stories and storylines and how they were going to come out. And then what you see in the product is Lieutenant. This was not just a Marine event. We had the Coast Guard. In fact, Commander Molly Waters. You see the artwork for the cover of her story, the first story on the baseline future. She wrote that story on her own with the coaching and some minor editing. The second story, Double 10 Day, was the result of 2 really good stories that Chuck was coaching. We ended up putting the authors together and combining the stories into one, because they were taking place in the same place, same time frame, and we got a good combination together. And then the third story, the Montgomery Crisis, has 6 authors on it. That was Max's project, and it was written in the same vein that he did World War Z, and he did that he based on Studs Terkel's The Good War, which is a series of interviews after the fact. So that's how the 3 stories came to be.
Aaron, give us sort of a 100,000-foot perspective on how you sort of see this fitting into the larger quest to understand the future.
Yeah, I think it fits in a couple different places. Certainly in my last job at Caris, we did a lot of work trying to think about analytical frameworks for the future of war, and that's both about you can think about near term 3, 4, 5 year sort of constructs, and then you can get well out into 2030 and then even beyond. I am not good at anything beyond the sort of 5 or 6 year piece of that, and you could argue whether I'm any good at that part either. But there are, we can think about, what's the future operating environment? Whether a country or a particular set of geographic features, are we likely to see conflict, or are we as Americans likely to fight? We can think about technology, and certainly that's what a lot of folks I think tend to focus on. What kinds of technological developments, directed energy or sea basing or these kinds of things are likely to be available to us, and therefore what should we be driving investment in? What are our adversaries likely to have available to them? And third, we can think about kind of specific conflict scenarios, right? And that tends to drive a lot of war game development, and you can get a lot of fighting of the exercise if your scenario isn't sufficiently grounded in some part of truth. But they all kind of come back to this first question. What do we think the future really looks like? And the National Intelligence Council released yesterday their new 2035 report, which they do at every first year of every presidential administration on big long-term trends. And that's a very interesting but kind of linear place to start. We kind of do straight line or reasonably straight line projections. So when we think about what the future looks like, there's a number of different both of those trends, but then also, what's the thing, that we aren't thinking about? What's the surprise? And one of the things that I think is useful to remember, in this conversation, and it's why efforts like this are so important, is that most folks in the intelligence community and in the broader defense apparatus don't spend most of their time thinking about the future, right? They might be thinking about the next year's budget cycle or sort of the next set of requirements coming down, but that's actually not, most people are not staring into a crystal ball all day trying to figure out exactly what's going to happen. It's a relatively small number of folks because most of the intelligence production is driven by the requirements process, known threats, right? There's enough bad stuff going on that we know about to not get distracted by all the stuff that we don't know about yet, right? And so I think that's, I talk about the difference between kind of secrets and mysteries or known threats versus problems of discovery, right? And fiction is really, really good place to think about those problems of discovery. If there was a zombie apocalypse, right? We talked, World War Z. How would you know, right? You don't have any frame of reference, for that. It's very similar to The Wire. If the Barksdale clan was running, a drug ring, how would you know? That's a very different set of intelligence and operational questions than working against the list of known threats. And so I love the way that this fits into both making us think hard about our assumptions about the future, but also thinking about if something were to dramatically shift, what would you need to know to keep track of that?
So Chuck, I want to have you talk a bit about your work. So Chuck's written 8 novels, 7 which have been national bestsellers, but he's also spent a fair bit of time consulting with Sigma, which is a group of science fiction writers whose work has been renowned in the literary space, but also they have acutely public-minded interests, and so work with various departments and agencies. So Chuck, I'd love to kind of hear how you sort of saw this as you said, well, am I going to do this or not? Why should I do it? Because you put a fair bit of time into this in your project. And then once we're done with that, I want to talk a bit about how we actually did the workshop, because I think there's something worth unpacking there.
The decision for me was a no-brainer in the sense that one of the reasons that I enjoy working with Sigma And there are about 45 of us. And I should say a couple of things about Sigma right off the top. Hard SF writers. It's not that we look down our nose at fantasy. Fantasy is actually outsells science fiction and outsells hard science fiction by at least an order of magnitude or more. There are probably a whole lot of reasons for that which are not germane to this particular session. However, what some of the requirements for Sigma are is you have to have an advanced degree. You have to have at least a master's. And I got an easy in because I only had I had my PhD in literary studies. So, but they needed somebody on the soft side, and I had a couple of Fulbrights back there, so I think that sort of equaled up, the folks who had the engineering degrees. So that's one thing. But the other thing about us is at least the first of every single meeting we go to, every single consultation we're invited to, it's pro bono. It is our I guess you could say, founder and chief cat herder, Arlen Andrews, I think, puts it well when he says science fiction in the national interest. That is not something that is nebulous. That's right up top. That's what we are. So, of course, when something like this comes along, which actually came along, we were talking about how it got started. I got started in this because Pat was sitting next to me at some other similar event and said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing X, Y, and Z?" And I made some, comment about woods and bears and where they do what sort of biological functions, and so found myself at Quantico not more than 2 months later. And this is not atypical for Sigma. And one of the things, though, that I should say, I brought up that term hard science fiction. That doesn't mean that you have to go to a special or illicit theater to witness it. What it means is that we play by rules. How many rules we play by and which varies according, I would say, to on a couple of axes. The taste and the interests of the author, certainly. Also the time frame. The closer you play to the current day, I would argue the more rules you absolutely have to follow for it not to seem like fantasy. As you go further out, it almost begins to reverse. It's not merely that you have more freedom, it's that the lesson of history is that we are not only are things changing and change is the constant, but they're changing faster and faster. If I were to ask you the last 5 pieces of technology you touched or utilized in the last 15 to 20 minutes, my guess is the majority of them did not exist outside of science fictional visualizations prior to 20 or 30 years ago. So knowing that that's there, I think is a very important thing. I don't want to run on too long because, yes, I am a retired academic, but that doesn't mean we ever get out of the bad habit of loving to hear ourselves speak. So I'm just going to say one last thing, which is that I do think that one of the things that Sigma and perhaps science fictional thought offers is that, in my experience of it, and yes, I've been in charge of a grad department, so I know how this works. Institutions, administrations have a tendency to want to narrow focus in order to essentially aim budget and effort at specific deliverables. That tends to create a culture. That culture is exactly the culture that I think Aaron was talking about. As a matter of fact, everybody else has spoken about, which is that notion of focus, a thing we are trying to achieve. Yet the further out you move into the future, the more uncertain you're ultimately going to be regarding which of the myriad, the infinite possible futures are actually going to be the components you're going to have to deal with. So in a sense, what a science fiction writer does, and science fictional thought does, actually is sort of in many ways at the opposite end of the spectrum from what institutional thought does, which is not bad. It's absolutely essential for its purpose. The last thing I would want to know that our Marines are doing as they're crawling up through the briar-clotted patch, I seem to recall, which was the title of the story again is
Operation Verbal Image.
Operation Verbal Image, is to be sitting there and thinking, well, I wonder how this would work elsewhere. Heck no, there's a job to do, and it's right now, and people are going to die if it's not done. But when you talk about reflection and projection, you do want to be able to sit back, and you do want to see the 360. And you want to do so, and this is where it's different from fantasy. Fantasy can go anywhere, envision anything, and fundamentally it's not breaking any rules. If you're doing science fiction, you're paying attention to some rules. What you're doing is hard science fiction, the bottom line is every single rule you break, if you break it, you have an explanation for it. I tend not to break rules. The only ones which differ from, for instance, what we see today are what I would call the loopholes that the current state of physics allows me to drive a Mack truck through. So that's some of the spectrum. But we're essentially, when you're seeing hard SF, and that's what Sigma does, what you're really looking at is, and that's why I called it rumors. It's a rumor in the sense that it's a conjecture. It's as much based upon fact as we can make it. And so that's a quick sketch of the spectrum, I would say.
And that's a relevant point in the context of how we approached this on the day when we were at Quantico. You know, these stories are rooted in a very thorough, researched survey of the future operating environment that the Marines forecast. And those were some of the boundaries that we were working within creatively so as to be useful. And the way that that was actually done also reflected the individual way each of us as writers worked with our respective groups, which I think was a really fascinating thing to watch. And the stories have some of that flavor in it as well, which I think speaks to the variety of approaches you can take when you are trying to create narratives about the future that doesn't exist, that's still tied to the world in a baseline scenario or the two others like we did here. Pat, I was going to ask you about the MCEF, the Marine Corps Strategic Environment Forecast document itself, and how much of that has to be respected to make these stories effective for the Marine Corps to be useful.
That's a great question. Tied to what Chuck said. So the research that went into the MCEF, compared to other foresight documents, one of the great strengths I think of the MCEF is that it's exceptionally well footnoted. Our editor-in-chief, Fulbright scholar, was a hard taskmaster, and in the research in Chapter 2, where we talk about the trends that we selected, any assertion in there had to be footnoted. Where'd you get that from? Granted, some of it is from other organizations' futures work, like the NIC, the United Nations.
National Intelligence Council.
Acronym prone. Anyways, the research is thorough. The baseline future is based off of the slope of those trends, and then the two alternative futures. We got together as a group once all the hard work was done, and we racked and stacked those trends based on their mutability, on what we thought was easily changeable, like technology, for example. Technology changes in the blink of an eye. Anyone who tracked the Consumer Electronics Show last week knows that all sorts of neat things were put out that are going to be commonplace in our house within the next 3 years. Things that don't change very rapidly, demographics. People do get up and move, which was the basis for Alternative Future A's story, international migration accelerated by environmental crisis, which, as we were writing it, started to bear fruit on the TV screen. But when we got the writers in the room and gave them a copy of the MCEF and went through the worlds that were in there, we told them, okay, as you start your stories, you're bounded by two things: the world that's laid out in the MCEF, because we want the stories to reflect those worlds, and then the laws of physics as we know them today, which goes to what Chuck said. The laws of physics as we know them today are different from the laws of physics as we knew them 100 years ago, and will certainly be different the way technology goes. Then we will know them probably in 10 years. We're just going to get better at conquering what we know the limits of physics being today. That's sufficiently...
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting concept to consider how much you should box yourself in. When we've crowdsourced our various writing contests and visual art contests, this is something we wrestle with. And Aaron, I was going to ask, I mean, how, if you are too hemmed in, that may make something easier to pitch or sell internally in an organization, but if it limits the effectiveness, is that just a waste of time?
Oh, there's no shortage of things that are a waste of time out there. And even the Marines can be tempted by that. I think that it depends on what is the goal of the exercise, right? If it's an effort in professional development, right, that may not matter, right? If it's trying to really work out a couple of competing operational concepts in different operating environments, then you don't want them to fight that exercise. You need people to have that sort of buy-in that, okay, this is a plausible thing, and so now I can think about this force sizing construct or this set of distributed operations, ideas, or this weapon system. If it's trying to grapple with the broad sense of uncertainty and making investments that are going to hedge, right? Then you can be a little bit, more broad. Or if sometimes it's easier actually to think about what the adversary might do, because you can introduce some kind of wild and crazy ideas when you're not just thinking about yourself. You're not locked into your own budget cycle or personnel system. So there is certainly an element of whenever you're whether you're trying to pitch a DARPA program or introduce new technology or try to get any change management exercise, showing people how it's part of what you're doing now and it's an extension is a persuasive element. Trying to convince people that, no, really, we should think about war in Afghanistan and it's 1998 and this is totally a thing that's going to happen. That's an uphill battle, even though obviously it did, right?
So Chuck, how do you build that bridge, in an organization to get people to consider what their blind spots might be?
I wish I could answer that in a productive and prescriptive manner. I would have to say I've been the beneficiary of that rather than the actuator of it. What's been interesting about this is the receptivity to science fiction that is tied to what I would call immersive futurism, and blame me for that title. But the notion, I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. There is, for instance, no shortage of apocryphal and even review data on the way that understanding of, for instance, the early onset of the nuclear threat environment really worked. You had tremendous amounts of coverage on that in places, in weekly news magazines and the big newspapers, and then if they ever did, when they occasionally did tests of what did you understand, what did you retain, that was kind of sketchy. Then you get a couple of narrative pitches at this. Day after, right, let me go all the way back to the beginning. On the Beach didn't do so much, but Failsafe and Alas Babylon, because they were about specific technologies in a specific world, in a specific circumstance, and yet it was people from all walks of life. It was people at the top of the command and food chain, as well as people at the bottom. And what that does is it brings in the investment of the reader, which is, I suppose, probably where the value of fiction and narrative really is. You can sit there, what is the saying, another wonderful idea killed by PowerPoint and graphs. And that's one of the challenges that I think we all face all the time, is we're trying to move ideas out there. But if you're able to take a person that a reader gravitates towards, associates with, and that person walks through a world of consequences that are being driven by these various technological or social catalysts, then all of a sudden it becomes real, it becomes imaginable, it becomes at least notionally tangible. And I think that's one of the main components to all this. But I think I got off your topic, which was
the idea that if you're trying to, it was a
ADD
professor's art right there.
Yeah.
The idea that you can use this to bridge people who believe in a status quo approach into convincing them that there is another alternative out there that they haven't considered yet, even if it's actually bad for their organization.
Well, we've seen that a lot. A lot of the people who contact us in the first place are already people who exist in that area, in that mindset, in that mind space, if you will. And what they wind up doing is sort of focusing as a liaison, I would say, between those of us who are dealing in this all the time, this sort of future think, more constrained, hard SF.
So not writing themselves, but kind of...
Exactly.
Right.
But being fairly good, I would say, purveyors, if you will, of the field, and then bring us in. And then what tends to happen is most people go, wow, there really was some value to this. Mm-hmm. And I think some of that is because they expect us perhaps to come in and talk about Star Wars or Star Trek. Well, I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's guilty or non-guilty pleasures here, but to me, Star Wars, the best you can say about it is it's techno-fantasy. I mean, you can take
we're
Star
going
Wars.
to have to agree to disagree.
This is going to be a very, very contentious panel.
See, I knew I was. I just said, little mean sister. Okay, I found it. Okay, but
it's an emphasis on the mean is the important part.
Okay. The point being that in the case of Star Wars, you can largely take what's going on there and you can translate it back and forth from a lot of medieval legends and myth cycles. And it is cyclic in its organization, if you will. And I'm not saying that makes it, I absolutely don't think it's lesser. It achieves different things. In terms of technological speculation, I don't feel like that's what Star Wars is trying to do, and I don't blame it for not doing it. However, when we go in, that's not what we're being asked to do. That's the distinction. And that's where I would say you get into the difference between hard science fiction, science, fantasy, et cetera. So once we come in and we do the job, and we are actually in many ways more constrained, self-constrained than very often the people who host us think,
Aaron, do you want
that changes things.
Jump in?
Well, I mean, we'll save my discussion of the politics of Star Wars and the utility of drop holsters for another time. But, I mean, I do think that one element of this that is important is that, you know, your folks who are either by habit or by billet are thinking about the future and thinking about how to do things differently. That's hard to do in a day-to-day line job, right? Where you're actually doing something else. So Mike Azenko has got a great book about red teaming, you know, and kind of how you cultivate that institutionally and develop it professionally. And futurism is similar, right? Trying to meaningfully think about the future is a pretty hard job, and then you actually need those folks as antibodies in an organization, right? And so you always, you know, big organization wants to Borg that, not to go to Star Trek, which is of course much lesser than Star Wars, but you know, they want to get their arms around it, but you kind of need those folks a little bit outside the everyday, you know, workings of the organization, because they need to be out there so they can tell you that, you know, you're doing that wrong, or I don't think that's going to happen, or these other kinds of things. And I think you should feel attention, right? If folks are doing their job thinking about the future, it should be something you haven't thought of, or you don't want to think about, or you know, otherwise sort of feel that you know, gutsy angst, you know, about things. Otherwise, it's, you know, you're just like in a palm process, and it's not that interesting.
I mean, there's a lot of conversation about, you know, the changing character of war. You know, it's inherently human, as an inherently human endeavor, and yet technology is having this impact that we see in these stories. And Pat, I want to talk to you a bit about how when you were kind of overseeing this and thinking about how to keep it relevant to the readers who range from someone who's 18, you know, and newly into the Marine Corps to a senior leader. How do you tease out that human element and not get lost in the technology, of which these stories have a lot of really interesting technology playing out, whether it's Marine riflemen being accompanied by battle bots or humanitarian disaster relief missions that are, in fact, semi-autonomous. So talk a bit again to kind of capture that human element. I mean, the cover, for example, of Water is a Fighting Word is an obvious play on that because it is, in effect, when you read the story, a crucial image from that tale.
Don't spoil the story.
I was very. It's
a really
literally
good
my
story,
favorite.
though.
You know, I don't want to pick like favorites in this anthology, but it's my favorite story.
I forgot to mention that August was the coach for the baseline story.
We love our children. Yeah.
I'll try to answer your question. So the human element of it and the target audience. The target audience of the McSef is probably field grade to maybe brigadier general level. Maybe I go up to the 2-3 star level. If you read this, or at least read the executive summary, you'll start thinking about what the deep future 15 to 30 years might be like, or what's going to be different about that. If you get past about page 16, 18, God bless you. I think it's a great document. I'm biased. Max Brooks described most government documents as printed Ambien. So if you have trouble sleeping, you just pick up. But there are people who pick up the McSef and read it for entertainment. I got to say I'm one of those. So the idea is to turn that into a narrative, because narrative, we can change people's perceptions more easily through narrative than we can through PowerPoint slides. If we make that target audience second lieutenants and lance corporals, and we get to them through stories, then 15 years from now, when that lance corporal is a master sergeant, when that second lieutenant is a major, and he's on a staff somewhere, it won't be the first time he's thought about that world that he's experiencing at that moment. Hopefully we get it right. I mean, I'll be the first one to tell you that any baseline prediction of the future is going to be wrong. That's not the future you're going to get.
How important is it to get it right? I mean, this is, I think, a good open-ended question. You know, an event like this, you know, is any one prediction supposed to nail it, or is the process what matters?
I think we have a traditional or a terrific tradition of not getting it right. And as the phrase goes, you know, you just want to you don't want to get it too wrong. But you have to be ready for anything,
Right.
and you just don't want to be too surprised when you get to
Chuck,
one of those
you should jump in
futures.
on this.
Yeah, there's an expression from a friend and a fellow Sigma by the name of Ben Bova. He's been doing hard SF for a long time. And he said a couple of things that I think directly pertain to this. One of the things is he said, first of all, if you want to make sure that a future doesn't happen, write a story about it. That is a guarantee. But at the same time, he said, but one of the things about writing hard SF, about the future, is that it allows you to consider the sort of worlds you want, and perhaps more pointedly, the sort of worlds you don't want, and to give them a shape and to give them a form and to essentially put them out there as notional navigation markers. What do we want to steer away from? What sort of, and maybe it's more dangerous than just we just don't want to head at that. There are currents that will tend us in that direction. So we have to be mindful of if we're feeling those currents as well. Going for something, that's generally a lot of a greater challenge. But one of the things is that, and this is, I guess, my own take, is that I've watched in many institutions that desire to drive down to what we are going to do, what we think is going to happen, which is a wonderful focusing of energy. But the question becomes, so if you put so many of your eggs in that basket, and that's not the future that happens, how prepared are you for the one that you do get? And I think the value of thinking about this not like a laser beam, but more like a dandelion, if you will, spreading out 360 by 360 in all directions is, will you predict the correct future? No. But you've probably, on one of your points, maybe come up with a couple of predictions that put back together say, okay, we don't have it dead to rights, but we've got some ranging fire on this. We know roughly where this is, and we can, as the situation evolves, begin to target in more tightly on it. And that's to give us sort of a graphic metric, sort of the way I would think about it.
One of the things we like to say as futures is that we don't do projection, or we don't do prediction, we do projection. And then I lost my other point. The other point.
It's a good one.
I think that point, though, that you're not necessarily in the act of prediction, but being as prepared as possible by considering something when the stakes are lowest, when you're reading words on a page, is ever more important as technology is changing faster, as how we're onboarding it, and using it is being pioneered in ways that not necessarily a centrally run organization or this town is going to be able to keep pace with or even get ahead of.
Can I footnote that with not only when the stakes are lowest, but when the costs are lowest.
Right.
And I mean not merely just in the sense of stakes of political and costs, but literally money. The Gedanken experiment does not require a lab other than the one that's located between maybe a dozen people's ears. That's what you do. That's the investment. You bring that in, you send it away. You don't even need to fund it inside your organization if you know where the assets are and you have those liaisons who know where they are and how to reach out to them.
We get asked the difference between what do you do as futurists that's different from what traditional Intel does? And my apologies in advance to anyone from the Intel community who gets offended by this, but Intel tries to take massive amounts of data in and reduce it to what's knowable. They want to give you a degree of certainty to what's going to happen. And that gets fuzzier for them the farther out you get. They tend to get very uncomfortable out beyond about 6 years. We want to take in that same amount of data and expand it to what's possible, and not necessarily what's knowable, but speculative. Think about what that future might be like.
Your conversation about Star Wars raises a good point because there's different flavors of science fiction, and I think it's probably worth talking a bit about how each of us sort of thinks about their relevance to these kinds of big national security questions. I mean, I've found that stories that aren't necessarily hard sci-fi, but are dystopic. I just read The Mandibles, is a relevant book it's sort of like a Whole Foods version of Atlas Shrugged, but it's good for kind of its depiction of decline in the Northeast, after political and economic collapse. But I think it's again a
Steal
relevant
that.
national security piece of literature, for that, because it is character driven. It is something that confronts the unthinkable in a way that's accessible. So maybe to talk a bit about how you sort of see that Star Trek versus Star Wars, so to speak, debate kind of playing out in this audience that you have, which is very acutely interested in trying to figure out some hard problems.
I'm not getting into the Star Wars Star Trek debate. I'm going to toss that over to Aaron.
Well, that's not a debate. It's a very settled question.
But I mean, there are these flavors of sci-fi, as the space opera versus cyberpunk.
For
right?
sure,
I mean,
and I'm a big fan of the cyberpunk, side of things. If you talk about, if you want a future to come true, write it down. I mean, Neil Stephenson's got an interesting track record on the other side of that.
Yeah.
Both, I read Snow Crash only a couple years ago, and I was like, this isn't that good, because it had already happened, right? I mean, I read it 20 years or 25 years, too late. Cryptonomicon, for the Marines in the room and those who love them, is a fantastic sort of mesh of, Bobby Shafto is an American hero and is a great sort of character in this space. But the part that I like best to think about kind of these real world problems is kind of what William Gibson's been up to the last, 10 or 15 years or so, with the Blue Ant series and then more recently The Peripheral, which I think is a fantastic book. And every time I see a new kind of climate report or something else, all I think is jackpot, right? Which is his sort of phrase for this political, economic, climatological conflagration that happens in the very near future. So it's near future science fiction, which is tough to do, right? You are quite constrained. But I think part of why I like that is that it's very rich, it's quite different, but you totally see how you get there from here.
Yes.
And he's really good at kind of taking some, whether it's designer genes or some small bit of technology and extending it forward in a way where you're like, yeah, I totally see how that could happen. And for me, that's space opera stuff tends to be more, let's think about ourselves in a way that's less disquieting, and so we'll put it either a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, or way off into the future. The most useful or most interesting thing about Star Trek is that we survived, right? The whole point is that in 300 years later, there's still humans. In an era of sort of nuclear conflict in the Cold War, that was a really optimistic thing to conclude. But I like the near-term stuff, and there's a lot of good options for that these days.
Chuck, what's your take?
My take is, well, first of all, I'm absolutely agnostic in the Star Wars and Star Trek debate. I need to make that very clear. I'm not. I appreciate them. I actually, for me, probably the most significant was probably the original series of Star Trek because of what it does in terms of articulating a change in culture. I mean, there really hadn't been anything on TV like that beforehand. There had only been a few movies like that, and all of a sudden there's something there like that, which has very low moments, but is asking us to think in a very, very different paradigm. That's, I think, useful. Like Aaron, I'm probably not a big fan of space opera, and one of the reasons I'm not is because one of the things you see about most space opera, as you said, whether it's in the far future or set notionally in a distant past, is it tends to be historically disconnected from our own moment. It doesn't. We don't see that throughput necessarily of cause and effect. So even if it gets the technology, makes some interesting technological points, it doesn't necessarily relate it to us, our moment, or our projected moment in any sort of tangible fashion. My own preference for science fiction, which is what drives what I write, was, so to give you another model or paradigm, is I kind of see the near future and techno thriller as a very sort of linked. They're linked genres. They're kissing cousins, and they're the near shore. They're the shore we're on, and it's essentially as we move to the future, the river of the future, to cross it. What might we run into? What's on our way? Space opera is, if you will, the far shore. That's where something has happened. I call it the utopist's dodge. Something happened, and now we're there. We're not here. So when I set out to write my stuff, I put us on the bridge, right at the start of the bridge, because to me that is the really interesting moment when something happens that is not an incremental shift, but it's one of those moments I can't remember the name of the writers who call it a mind shift, where something is different. A thing has changed, which makes certain objectives, certain achievements possible, which were just not achievable or realistic the moment before. How do we react? How do we react in the sense of our society and our institutions as largely evolved from the current day? So it's really sort of a fusion of answering the question, if we were headed for that very different future, what does it look like when we start that journey?
The stories in the science fiction anthology, we don't want to spoil them for those that haven't read them, but I think it is worth spending some time talking about almost the lessons learned from them as much as we can without ruining the creative surprise and joy of reading a great piece of fiction. Let's talk a bit, Pat, about some of the things you took away from the way that the Marines and Molly Waters and others depicted these worlds, things that you didn't know before when you first worked on the McSEF, to where you now have this annex.
Well, so I sat in I sat in Max's group, and Max had an interesting technique for going through the story, and for going through the McSEF. And what he did was, there were 7 of us in the room, and we went through Alternative Future B, a paragraph at a time. We each read a paragraph out loud in turn, and then talked about what that meant. And that gave us a baseline after about 30 minutes of reading and discussion. That gave us a baseline for how we were going to do that story. And he was able to pull a couple of perspectives out of that are reflected in the story that I didn't see when I was the one who put the Alternative Futures together. I didn't see those aspects when I actually wrote it. So that was beneficial. Hopefully the final lessons learned aren't done, because the intent is we can take these stories, which have a strategic world, stories written at the tactical level, then we take that story and we have, in essence, a friendly and enemy order of battle. We've got an environment, and we can take different force structures and wargame them and see if our operating concepts or our force structures work in that world. And if they don't, we can monkey around with them in the wargaming process, make changes, and see what does work.
Based off the stories.
Yeah.
Aaron, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that most of these are relatively near future. I mean, it's not a deep futures, exercise. And so I think, for me, those can often be like a very, really good Rorschach, right? So a couple of them are set in kind of dense urban environments or megacities, where we've done a lot of work. And so when you're reading that, when you go through and you're like, I don't know if that would happen. Well, why not? Like, what about that do you think? What projection would you make differently? What, we would or would not have heads-up visors. There would or would not be, water bots, these kinds of things. And I think that's more so than getting any one prediction right, is this sort of that forcing that conversation, within the, whether it's a scenario development group or just, as I think they could be really useful, as officer professional development exercises, right? So instead of reading, about a Civil War battle for the 100th time, Dale, I'm talking to you, then you'd think that your first teaching partner at your first job would be able to learn PowerPoint, right? Like if you're working for the Marine Corps, right? Then no, you get Dale, and you're doing his PowerPoint for 100 years after that. But you, instead of doing another historical exercise, each of these stories actually can be really useful for forcing that conversation. What are these elements that persist? What remain of the human elements, of war? Does it all come back to MCDP-1 warfighting? Or, are there things that the technology means, no, squads need to be, 3 and not, 8. They need to be 32. And, how do we rethink about, some of those things? And that's, you don't have to get very far into before all of those wheels start turning in your head.
You actually got an email the day after we did the first online publication of it. Captain from Paris Island emails and says, "Hey, sir, you mind if I print out 300 copies to use for PME?" No, not at all. Go ahead. Just give me the results of that PME. Let me know what your Marines think of it.
All right.
Chuck, what about you, and kind of going from the world in the McSEF to what you learned from how the Marines interpreted it in their fiction?
Sure. What we basically did was we took our particular scenario, and so anybody who's familiar with the 2 stories, and we solicited a bunch, double 10 days. So obviously that's telling some folks Taiwan figures significantly in this. And indeed, that's where it's set. And I can kind of, I'm going to use how we got there as maybe an illustration of this. We looked at the MCEF, but everybody had sort of looked at the MCEF already. So we put that aside. And there was a concern with, well, we need to know about writing. And my attitude was, there isn't the time in one day to really change your writing chops that much. That's what's going to happen when the stories come in and we work with them. But right now, what we need is a world. We need to turn this into a specific place, a specific time with specific consequences and specific conflicts. So we started thinking. Now, megacities, exactly. That was one of the first things that came up. And that's one of those, there are all sorts of, as Aaron was talking, you've got the technological predictions, and then you've got the harder predictions to hit, but there are certain social predictions. For instance, if we take a look at the trend, and this was literally what we were speaking about, how much, as you get the collapse from old rural into urban, and urban gets into the problem of how many satellite utility networks are you going to be able to put up? Is there going to be a temptation to go vertical rather than, if you will, lateral sprawl? What is that going to do? That's going to create a certain kind of, it's going to create a change in the environment of living. It's going to be a tactical change. It's also going to be a social change. The tendency of an undercity to evolve. The tendency of perhaps, and also at the same time you're looking at nation-state actors not being the only actors in the situation anymore. Is Bitcoin or is something else going to come in as a sort of translational currency fashion? If water and utility is going to be the way that you're moving to try to, if you will, approach and work with different social groups in that setting, are the nations going to be the fastest actors? Are they the ones who are going to have the highest interest in doing so? Our group said no. It's probably corporations. The corporations who also are deeply tied into that translational currency. So now you have a situation where you have a whole other, in addition to that sort of bilateral, red team, blue team, you got the gray team, the gray market team. And they have their own agendas, and they have their own success situations that they're essentially plotting into this. That's what we spend all our time doing, working on. It was a dry erase board, and I just went around the room and I said, "What do you see happening?" We put them up there. We threw them up there. I said, "Which things go together? Okay, which things seem almost inevitable? Which things are more marginal?" And we started grading that out. And we said, okay, so where would that be likely to take place? We looked at a couple of places like Jakarta. We looked at Taipei. We looked at Singapore. In the final analysis, we chose Taipei or Taiwan in general, and the situation being that there was a nuclear problem, and that there was an evacuation, and that everybody was now trying to, if you will, appeal to, but also get increased influence in the stricken island. And that created the, if you will, and then I said, write stories about it. Whatever stories you want. That's where our focus was.
This humanitarian mission is a theme that is present throughout all of them, that the non-combat humanitarian and disaster relief mission can also cycle in and out of almost like a combat mission, in a day. But that's a theme, I think, throughout, in part sparked by the MCEF's water deprivation, I think, thesis in there. We're around 20 minutes left, so we're going to start to take some questions from the audience. I'm very patient. What I'd like you to do is keep your questions short, like a tweet, and identify yourself by your name and organization, so the folks who are listening online or watching can hear who you are. We'll have a microphone coming up, sure, right there.
Hi, Mark Pomerlo with C4ISRnet. You've all addressed this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could go into some more detail about how this project and initiative could affect future operating concepts, both from a Marine Corps perspective and the broader Department of Defense.
I think, as I described it, the goal of we've got a cycle for MCEF. So the MCEF, as General Alford alluded to, is kind of the headlights for the warfighting lab. We'll go out to the deep future, consider what that future operating environment is going to be like, and then we have that environment. We've got concepts on the shelf that we can, and force structures that we can apply to that environment, test them out through wargaming. If they don't survive wargaming, back to the drawing board, pull another concept off the shelf and test it. If it does survive wargaming, then it moves on to live force experimentation, survives live force experimentation, then we start developing doctrine, then we start spending money to actually buy that force. And all along, and we've got a PowerPoint slide that kind of describes the process.
Did Dale make it?
And then no, but he approved it, I think. He hasn't yelled
He's
at me
good
about
at that. You probably did.
In the middle, there's a cog that says science and technology. We've got a science and technology division. And technology is the fastest thing that comes at you. And that touches all along. It has one aspect 15 to 30 years from now. It has another where I can go out, I almost said Radio Shack. I can go out to Walmart and buy something off the shelf and field it to a Marine in a matter of a couple of days. So that's kind of how the process goes from examining the deep future to hopefully, if we get it kind of right, procurement and investment in the force.
And this is, one way to think about this is that these questions are about the software of military force, which is to say strategy, and the use of force, and whether it's force employment, operating concepts. Elliot Cohen's new book, which is about hard power, spends a fair amount of time, talking about this particular piece of it. And most folks, or a lot of folks in the broader enterprise, focus on the hardware questions. And those are kind of driven by what we think the future adversary or future threat world is going to look like. But procurement timelines are so long that things start to get a little hinky in that process. So, one place where, this is kind of, to me, a really fantastic starting point. Thinking about operating concepts in alternate futures, much less even our own, it's actually really hard. Right. It takes some, and it's more art than science, and you need an array of people with, you need grunts, you need technologists, you need people from the different components and different services to really get an understanding of how are you going to actually use force in these different things, and to what end. And I think that this hopefully can drive that process, even further, whether in traditional war gamings or in a more general staff kind of concept.
And one other point, I hope I didn't convey that the answers are all technologically driven. They're certainly not. Mm-hmm. Technology can answer some of those problems, but wetware between the ears is going to solve most of them. Chuck?
Obviously, not having any direct input, I speak very with great care in this regard, because I'm guessing. But I think one of the things that keeps coming to me as I look at the choices that are ahead of us, whether that's driven directly by technology, indirectly by technology, changing global conditions, is our cultural and political. I know here I am a hard SF author and I'm going soft right away. But my point, or my primary focus there is, what as a culture are the decisions that will ultimately fit well with us as a culture? For instance, I'll give you one for instance. So we're standing on the threshold of some very interesting automation possibilities, talking about, for instance, Ghost Fleet. What is the difference between a dedicated ROV, which has a remote operated vehicle, that is really it's a robot only in the sense that it can, let's say it has communication breakdown, it can get itself through a brief interval of time before it comes back under operator control, versus fully autonomous, essentially a fire and forget automaton. What does that mean culturally when they start showing up with their different strengths and weaknesses? Because those systems are almost certainly going to have very different strengths and weaknesses, one of which is going to be tied to accountability. And what does that mean for us as a culture? Should we always be going for the thing that seems to promise the biggest bang for the buck right now? Or is there also a dimension where we have to sit back and say, 20 years from now, 5 years from now, are we going to think, oh my God, we bought the glitz, but we didn't look at the back end. And the back end is now actually more of a problem than the front end was a help to us. So I think... That argument's going on. Yes. And so that's, I think, some of the sort of impacts and resonances of what we do. Question, Sidney.
Yes. Hi, Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. Let me ask
Actually, you're also a finalist in our first contest, by the way, for a story called Tellin is Burning, which is excellent, and it is on our website and worth reading because it was...
It's free and worth every penny.
That's right, it's free and worth every penny, but it's also, as the world that we're in right now, incredibly relevant, and it's very well written, and I commend that to you all. And now back to your question.
Thanks. Tallinn, for the record, is the capital of Estonia, which I kept misspelling in my first draft because there's so many L's and N's. But I'm Latvian, so I wouldn't know. But the question I have to ask is, are there common themes that emerged from the workshops and the other things you guys have been pulling in, especially common themes that would have surprised you? And presumably common themes that Marines will be relevant in the future is probably no-brainer given the audience. But there might be themes that emerged that were more surprising or even countercultural.
With the first draft of the stories, we did have to take a little editorial license and say no. One of the story submissions had the Marine Corps had been absorbed into the Army, but there was still this counterculture that was resistant to it, where the E7 isn't called a gunnery sergeant anymore, but the corporal winks and says gunny anyways. So the Marine Corps continues to survive despite having been absorbed into the Army. We said no, the Marine Corps will continue to exist. And the other was that the force that was fighting in the second half of Double 10 Day was originally Walmart security forces, because Walmart's production base was in Taiwan, and they had the interest in protecting that, so they had procured their own force. Another one of the themes in drawing down in the Montgomery crisis, and the primary author for the Montgomery crisis stories is sitting here in the front row, Phil Pornell. Thanks, Phil. The U.S. in Alternative Future B had experienced a huge financial and military drawdown. So we actually had to reconstitute a Marine Corps force and put it aboard a ship and send it off to do a mission, because we were so focused inwardly on problems that we had here in the U.S. With that, I won't spoil any more of that story. So, future financial crisis and drawdown, I think was a common theme. Humanitarian and megacities. Megacities seems to be where we're definitely pointing, and not like Fallujah and not like Way City, but like Manhattan, not on a weekend, with just a lot of people, and you can't pick out the enemy, and you can't just shoot them, and you got to figure out how to clear a skyscraper, and you can't just hang green T-shirts in the window or break chem lights off and say I've cleared this room. We got to figure out how we're going to handle those kind of situations. So that seemed to be.
I think also I'll just interject too. In Water is a Fighting Word, the main character's life back home in America, the main character's a Marine, how that experience impacts how he feels about his mission abroad, and it's directly relevant. And it's a touching story, for that reason. But I think it also reinforces that this is a human experience, we're talking about, and that you can discuss technology and game changers and other elements that are at a macro level, but if you lose sight for a minute of the importance of the human experience in conflict, you're not going to fulfill your job of doing useful fiction. You guys want to weigh in on that one too, or do you? Good. On that? In the back there with a.
Andrew Herr, Helicase.
Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. How did you have to work with authors to prevent them from, on one hand, mirror imaging and either applying our present day or American sort of notion of culture to the Americans in the story, or on the other end, just sort of totally taking the other side and saying, for example, they have no ethics or they don't care about these things at all, and just sort of making them a very extreme version of something else. So how did you work with those? How much did you have to? And then how does that help you think about how we might help the force not do those things as well?
So most of the authors are a little younger than I am, without disclosing my age. They wrote rather diverse characters, so I don't think it was without being asked to. We had another editor out on the West Coast. Her name was Trina Phillips. Works for a company called Sci Futures. Who actually, to put the plug in, Sci Futures helped NATO put together a collection of short stories that they've got out on the web, and August helped with that too. Everybody seems to be picking up the science fiction bubble, but in fact, the only change that she made was there's a Gunny Hitada in Water is a Fighting Word, who was Michael Hitada and then became Michelle Hitada, and but there was no difference in the character other than I had to go through the story front to back and change the he's to she's and him to hers.
My take on the stories, they are mirror imaged. I mean, it's current personalities and current ways we think about ourselves as Americans, placed in these future settings. So it's not dealing with some of these social questions that might really change how you think about things. I don't think that there's a lot of question of like how recruitment works, right?
Yeah.
I don't remember references to like whether it's now a draft army or there's conscription or other mechanisms. So it's not, I don't think, playing a lot with those questions. But it's so they're sort of holding that constant while adjusting several other features, technology and obviously an operating environment in particular.
There's an element to what you leave out in a short story that's really important as well, because it allows your reader to use their imagination. So whether it's a conscript or all-volunteer force, or whether there is some political movement at home that's causing disturbances or ripple effects abroad. Now, some of that I think is that a really important exercise as well to give people enough, especially in the confines of a fairly compact story versus a larger novel or something like that. And that's actually really one of the exciting things about writing them and editing them, I think, too, is figuring out what is that sweet spot, right? So you're just on that tightrope, not going too far on one side and falling into the abyss of someone turning to the next thing they were supposed to do instead of reading your story.
With a real fast practical view that I've been fortunate enough to hear a fair amount of authentic radio chatter, and I can tell you that if you tried to write that, you would not sell that to a general audience because they would have no idea what is being spoken about. So you are automatically in the role of being a translator to remain true to what the tempo is and the urgency and the human dynamics and the information stream, but without creating it in a specialized language, which after all has changed immensely just in the last 20 or 30 years and is unrecognizable to 60 or 70 years of change. So you're always, as you say, negotiating and searching for that translational sweet spot.
I think Sarah Vowell said about writing short stories that it's like hosting a dinner party in a studio apartment, right? So it's as much of what you have to leave out as what you can put into it. And there's definitely a couple places where the authors do a really nice job in kind of a throwaway line giving you a whole bunch of color as to what might be going on, but it's not further clarified or expanded upon. It's just a passing reference, and I do think that that's a really useful way of bringing. It's again that the usefulness of narrative, right? It's not a bullet. It's not an underspecified bullet on a PowerPoint slide.
Right.
It's a statement that somebody would make if they were living. They wouldn't have to explain it to their brother if they're talking to them, on the radio or on the phone. They, because you're already in that context. You, as the reader, are the one who's got to trying to figure out what's happening.
This is also why the stories have this visual component. Small graphic novel type images embedded throughout. It's why the covers themselves, why Pat put so much energy and effort into making that work, because it also helps, I think, fill in some of those gaps. We've got about 3 minutes left. If I can take some final questions.
Hi, thank you very much. Dan Sofio, CSIS. I just had a quick question, sort of in crafting science fiction narratives sort of to inform, say, a national security interest, do you find that there's a tension between trying to be predictive and being cautionary or didactic? Thank you.
That's a good question.
The nice part about working in the 15 to 30 year time frame is that you're not playing with anybody's rice bowls. So, if I create a world where there are no tanks aren't necessary, I don't have someone tapping me on the shoulder going, I have a 2-star tapping me on the shoulder go, I'm a former tanker, you need more tanks in this world, in this story. Or, hey, Kirch, need more F-35 flavor in this story. We get to get beyond that world, and we really do try not to be predictive. We try to be honest, intellectually honest, in where the trends that we've studied are taking us and what we've chosen to vary. Any?
Maybe a final question, and then Pierre in the back.
Pierre Chow with Renaissance Strategic Advisors. We tend to do a lot of scenario-based planning in a more traditional strategic planning sense, and we found that in the end, it's not about living in the scenarios, but looking what's common across them. So in how formal are you guys doing the meta-analysis of the stories to look for commonalities? It's a little bit what trends are you seeing, or is that more informal? I'm likening it a little bit to being an editor of an anthology in some ways, right? Where you're trying to find some commonalities. Is that a formal part of this process, or is it something that's kind of bubbling out, the deliberate look for common trends amongst the stories?
The three worlds that were written in the MCSEF are based off of the. We started with 27 trends. We looked at what a lot of different organizations were looking at. We looked at UK Ministry of Defense. We looked at the NIC. We looked at Bundeswehr will be in the next one, but we got that one a little too late in the process. We've got this terrific spreadsheet of all of the trends that these different organizations look at. We picked 27 that we thought were relevant to the Marine Corps, and we binned them into 7 categories. Those 7 categories became Chapter 2. We had about 16 white papers. Some of them were throwaways. Some of them we kept and fleshed out into that chapter in the MCSEF. Those created the baseline world. And from the baseline, we developed the 2 alternative futures. So there's already commonality in those worlds as they were created. The stories just extended from that. So
Just a quick
The stories
follow-up.
aren't
going back to the
They're not independently drawn observations, right? They're a common framework to.
Right, but if you turned it on its head, did you
Yes.
discover a 28th trend because the people in writing it sort of?
So I can't go into details about this one, but there was something very early on in my time with Sigma where we were brought in, there were 10 of us brought in, and the only prompt we were given is, what keeps you up at night when you think about what the world is going to be like 30 years from now? And it was all Sigma. Part of the requirement was that we all wrote a story for it. So in that event, I think it's a matter of which end of the telescope you're starting to look through. So I think it's really, to some degree, it's up to the person who's shaping the task. And then that's exactly what they did. They sort of cut us loose and they put up the cameras, and we made all sorts of drawings that were undecipherable to anybody except for those in the room, and sort of did that information intake, went back and in fact did a meta-analysis, which of course, because they did their job right, we never heard about.
I mean, I think to kind of capstone your question, because it's a good one in that, how do you take this forward? The creative piece that builds on the analytical. And I think, for example, the commonality around a world that is somewhat in crisis overseas, finds the Marine Corps doing missions that are much more relief-oriented, for example, with elements of combat missions. I think that would be a takeaway that would influence the wargaming, the doctrine testing, and even equipment kind of concepts that you start playing with. We're up against our time limit, and there's nothing worse than a think tank event that draws long. So I'd rather use that extra time, if we have any left, to download these stories. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, General Alford, for your talk earlier, and the panelists as well, if we can give them a round of applause.